Here's how to lay out a palette. You should use a palette knife and you should have a full palette today, which means you need to refill some of those wells with other colors. So you have yellow, you have red, you have blue, you have white, black if you want it, but you can add on to some of the other colors that we have available. There's not going to be enough room for all of them, but you can see that the palette is where you keep all the mother piles. And from the palette, you use a palette knife to transfer the colors onto the table. Now, when you're transferring colors, you do need to wipe your palette knife on a paper towel in between dipping into a pigment. It is super important that you wipe your palette knife off before dipping into a different color hue. So when I switch from red to blue, I absolutely have to make sure my palette knife is spotless before dipping it into the blue paint that's in the palette and then transferring it onto the palette, which is a table palette. If you are working in the same family, you don't have to clean it off necessarily, but you do want to make sure that you're not contaminating those mother piles, which means you don't want to get mixed paint in there. And you should lay it out in this order. So I'm going to show it to you. You have the lightest yellow, a medium yellow, yellow ochre, you have orange, red, blue, darker blue, purple, and then I put the green on there too. To the left should go your white. To the right would go your black. So far left is white, far right is black. I'm not using black for this demonstration. I'm just going to add a pile of white. Double check to make sure that the amount of paint that you're putting on the table is the bare minimum. You can always replace it. The only paint that you should put a lot of is white because we use it so much in mixing. So your white can be a pretty decent amount, and your other pigments should be about the size of a pea or maybe even half of a pea. Before moving on to mixing, it's important that you take your circular palette and you can wipe off any pigment that's on your blade, your palette knife blade, and then you can cover that palette up. That palette should always remain with a loose covering of saran wrap so that air doesn't get in there, and while you're busy painting, all those big mother piles get dehydrated because that's horrible when they get tacky. So you should have your whole palette on your table laid out just like this. Yellows on the left, your warms in the middle, and then blues, greens, violets to the right. And I'm going to show you how to do a little bit of mixing with a knife. You may have experience with a knife, you may not, so I'm just going to go ahead and show you. And that color to the right, by the way, is violet. It's hard to see. Maybe you can see it a little bit bigger now that I've added white to it, so I shifted it to a tint. I wanted to show you how to do mutes. We talked a little bit about mutes the other day. A mute is when you take two complementary pairs and then you slowly mix them together. Well, you don't have to slowly mix them together, but I'm going to show you how to slowly increase the amount of color influence. So I'm starting with some yellow and adding a little bit of that kind of lavender color to the yellow. The thing about mutes is they kind of look ugly, but you really need them. I use them all the time when I'm doing interiors. If I'm doing a figure, I use them when I'm doing landscape. You kind of need the mutes, those subdued colors, to help some of the other colors pop out. So here I am adding progressively more purple as I move to the right. And you can see what I'm doing essentially is cutting out colors. And I wipe using that blade of the palette knife. And I'll wipe on both the front and the side, and then I'll kind of spin it in a circle. And I'll flip it like I'm flipping a pancake. Like imagine the palette knife as a spatula to flip. It's super important that if you're mixing with a palette knife, you mix thoroughly. I love working with a palette knife. I'll tell you why. That's because I'm saving my brush hairs, but I can also mix thoroughly. So I know exactly the hue, the color that's there. I know it's going to look the same way when I put it on my paper or on my surface. With a brush, you might have saturated it before, so you might have other colors on your brush, and then you go to use it and it's all contaminated, and it's much easier to get something called mud, which is when all the colors look murky. Although this will look kind of hazy too, because it's a mute. Mutes tend to be kind of earth tone-y. I would use this kind of mute, the violet one, you could use that for like a gray day. If you add enough white to it, that could be your gray day sky. So there are the main complementary pairs. You know them, of course you do. Yellow, violet, orange, blue, red, green. There are other complementary pairs other than that, like there's red, violet plus yellow, green, and there's a couple other ones that are fun, and you can mix those ones in too. So this is giving you some recipes. What are a few suggestions if you don't know? It's like, oh yeah, I made all the colors. Well, guess what? There's a whole bunch more to be made. So this is what you can do if you don't know what to do next. I would start to make your mutes. Orange does work as a mute. By the way, I'm making my own orange there because we have orange in a tube, like in a container, but I always think you'll make a better orange if you mix it yourself. So I took some of that yellow and I added a drop of red. You have to be careful with red. It's one of those colors that likes to strong arm other colors, so a little bit goes a long way, which is one of the reasons I like the palette knife, because I can control how much pigment is on the side of my blade. And I just put my orange next to the actual orange pigment that came from a tube, so you can compare and see the difference. I think my orange is a lot more attractive, but that's just me personal. So here you can see me wiping. I'm always wiping because I don't want to contaminate these piles either. That's a big issue. You don't want to have everything getting contaminated, and otherwise, like if you do, it'll look like you swirled a whole bunch of colors together, which we all know makes icky brown. So I'm going to speed this up, but what I'm doing is I have a main pile of orange, and then I'm slowly adding orange's complement to it. So it's orange plus a dot of blue, orange plus a little bit more blue. Now here's what it's going to look like with red and green, which is one of my favorite color combinations, by the way. I use red and green all the time in foliage and stuff like that. It also makes a beautiful cranberry color. I like to make my own green though. That green that we have, it's okay. It's like that Slimer green, and I want to make a more interesting green, so I'm thinking more like forest green. So I'm taking the darkest blue on there, and I'm going to add yellow to it. So it's kind of like a lemon yellow plus a phthalo blue, and what's that going to equal? It should equal a dark forest green. That blue will take a lot of yellow to influence. So I accidentally made too big of a pile, which is something that I saw you guys do the other day. So just make sure that you're careful with how much paint you're using, because it's hard to put that paint back into your palette, your like little to-go palette. But anyway, I'm adjusting that to get a forest green, and then I'm going to slowly start to add the green into the red. And you can see I'm getting multiple kind of swatches of different hues. So that's like a progression in terms of the mutes, how much green to red ratio. So you can see the one kind of to the left, that's looking more like cranberry sauce. And then I keep adding more of the green to it, and it starts to shift. And what it will become is an earth tone. Those earth tones are really good. They're useful for when you're doing things like foliage, so leaves and trees and shrubs, that kind of stuff. I also think it's good to take these mutes that you've made and change them with a tint. So I'm just adding white to them and see how that changes, because it's pretty dramatic, right? Like once you add white to a color, it's like, oh, that looks different. So it's not a bad idea to make these colors, use them, and then add a tint to it. Again, you really want to use a really thin amount of paint. If you could see the side view of this, it's very limited amount of paint that I'm allowing myself to use. If it dries, I can always get more from my piles that are above the palette, or if I run out of those, then I just replace it with paint from my like to-go palette, that circular one. Here's what you do at the end of the day when I give you the notice that it is time to clean up. Please don't clean up prematurely. I will let you know. So what you're doing is you're taking any existing paint that's still good and not completely muddy, and you're going to scrape that off, and you're putting it back into your circular palette to preserve it. And by the way, you always keep your palette covered during the class, so that circular palette should stay covered with the saran wrap because you don't want that to be exposed to the air. It's oxygen which dries these paints out, so you want to keep that covered loosely. So now I'm putting back each pigment that I have leftover paint, and that's just from the top row where I laid out the initial palette. I am wiping in between each time I scrape up some. If I have some paint that I made, like that green, I thought, oh, that's beautiful, and I have some extra, I'm putting that in the center. So you can scrape up paint that you've pre-mixed and save it for a later date. Now you do have to make sure that you put the saran wrap back onto your palette, your circular palette, and that has to be on pretty tight because you don't want any air pockets in there. So it's a pretty good seal on there, and I line it up with the pigment colors that are on there from the day before. And we are using these for at least a month before you get a fresh sheet of saran wrap, so make it last. Just as a reminder, your palette does need to go back into your box, and so do your brushes, and the brushes should be rubber banded together, and a palette knife should also go in there too. And then close it and return it to the shelf. Make sure it's returned to the same spot that you found it. Here is how you're going to clean the table palette. So you are going to give a couple of squirts with that solvent stuff, the cleaner, and then you're going to be taking a paper towel. I go in circles when I do this and try and rub off as much paint as possible. But you know what? We're here for a long amount of time, and sometimes those paints can kind of dry up on you, so they create like a pancake of paint that will stick to the surface. So you've got to go a couple steps further. So I'm just using the spray, paper towel, but if that doesn't work, you go to the next level. We do have a number of these broad scraper tools. They work great, by the way. So you can kind of use it as sort of like a chisel. Don't dig into the table, please, but gently scrape off the high places. Now that's not going to do everything. Likely need to take a green scrubby and further scrub it. I put a tiny bit of that hand foam soap, the hand soap that is in the dispensers. So the goal is that you get the table back to being gray, and there should be no tints and there should be no raised spots of paint. I am going to be checking these because you guys did a okay job. I'd say it was like C work as far as cleaning the tables. Just make sure that you do a really thorough job and you get them back to being clean. Ideally, these tables should be super clean at the start of the day, and they should be still clean by the time you come into your class at the start of fourth period, because the class before you should have done a good job cleaning too. And you can whistle blow on anybody who's left like a gob of paint on the table because it's not cool.